In the previous learning objective, we looked at all 6 trig functions and their graphs, just so we can kind of see what the basic graphs look like. But for the rest of the unit, we're just focused on sine and cosine, and we're going to do what are called sinusoidal graphs. So you can see it kind of starts off with our sine. It's just graphs related to sine and cosine. All right, so what do sinusoidal functions look like? So they start with our basic sine or cosine function. I always just write it with the sine function because they're called sinusoidal functions, but they can also be with cosine. We have our basic sine function, and there's 4 different things we can do. We can add and subtract outside the function, or we can add or subtract inside the function. All right, these are going to change our functions in 2 different ways. We can also multiply inside the function or multiply outside the function. All right, so there's these kind of 4 different operations we can do to our function, and it's going to change the way that our graph looks. And any of these types of functions are known as sinusoidal functions. So our goal that the next series of learning objectives is to just figure out what each of these letters is going to do. So in this video, we're going to look at D, and how does this D affect our graph. All right, so we're going to look at sine of x plus D. All right, so let's look at this graph, or these graphs. All right, so we have sine of x, that is in red. We have sine of x plus 1, that is in green. Sine of x plus 2 in blue. Sine of x minus 3 in black. All right, so what do you think is happening when I change this D value? And you might notice that as I do plus 1, that green graph is higher than the red graph. When I do plus 2, it's even higher than the original red graph. I do minus 3, now it's lower down than the original graph. So what's happening when I add or subtract this number, it's just taking my whole graph, whatever shape it is, and just sliding it up or maybe sliding it down. All right, so D is going to change how high my graph is. And the actual thing that we're going to use to kind of reference D a little bit easier is known as the midline. So if I have some sinusoidal wave, the D value is going to be whatever goes straight through the middle of my graph, and that'll end up being whatever that value is there. All right, so what is the midline of this function? So for some simple ones, you can kind of just eyeball and say that's probably the midline right about there. So my midline is y equals 2. But I can be more precise about it. The midline is the middle, the average of the top value and the bottom value. So the top value happens at 4. The bottom value happens at 0. And how do you find the average of 2 numbers? You add them together and divide by 2. All right, so that is the mathematical way to guarantee you actually got the correct midline. All right, so when you're doing these problems, y equals 2 is the midline. This tells me that this is the graph of sine of x plus 2. All right, what's the midline of this one? Again, you can try to guesstimate it. Let's just do it mathematically. All right, our top value is 0. Our bottom value is negative 2. Add them together, divide by 2. I know my midline is y equals negative 1. Again, let's put it on the picture just to make sure it makes sense. Yep, and that line goes straight through the middle of my sine wave. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. All right, find the midline of this sinusoidal function. And the answer you get is that your midline is y equals negative 1. Again, just taking the average of the top value, 3, and the volume value, negative 5, gives you that midline, negative 1. All right, so for this learning objective, you're going to complete problems on Delta Math. You're going to do 10 of these problems. They should go pretty quickly. Again, you're just taking the average at the top of your wave and the bottom of your wave to get your midline.